In this video, we'll be looking at the CSS Box Model. As this page on W3 Schools indicates, in CSS the term box model is used when we discuss design and layout. The CSS Box Model is essentially a box that wraps around every HTML element. It's a container with margins, borders, padding, and the actual content, which is to be displayed inside of the HTML element that's applied to the box model. So as you can see in this image, the content is what would be written inside of the open and closing HTML tags. The padding clears an area around the content, so it adds some spacing around the content. Otherwise, each piece of content would be bunched up against one another. The padding is transparent. You don't see the padding that surrounds the content, but it's there to provide some spacing. The border is an actual visible border which goes around the padding in the content. So you start with your content, you have the invisible padding, then you can put a border around the padding and content, and that can be displayed on the page. The margin is an area outside of the border which adds more space. So if you think of a Word document and you want spacing around the content inside of your Word document, you would add a margin and push that content in. Well, we can also apply a margin around our HTML elements regardless of what the content is, and that margin can be applied to the top, the right, the bottom, and the left of the border, which contains the padding, which contains the content. Scrolling down on the page, we see a Try It Yourself button. So we'll click that, and let's clean this up just a bit. So we don't need the H2 or the paragraph. Let's change the div to an H1, the matching closing H1, and just change the text here to welcome. We'll run this, and now we see our H1 on the page. So let's go into the style that they provided. We'll change the div to an H1 and run this, and now we see the styles applied. Just go ahead and add text align center and apply this, and now it looks pretty good. So clearly, by looking at the style, we see they've given this a background color of light gray. The width of the element is 300 pixels. There's a 15 pixel solid green border, which we can clearly see around the content. There's a padding of 50 pixels, a margin of 20, and we just align the text center. We can use developer tools. If we right click and inspect this and scroll down to the bottom of the CSS styles, we actually see the box model in our developer tools. And we can actually go into developer tools and change some of these settings. So right now we've set the width of this element to 300 pixels. If we want to make it a square, we could set that to 300 pixels as well. The padding, we look over here in the CSS, has a padding of 50 pixels. Now this means a padding of 50 pixels on the top, on the right, on the bottom, and on the left. I could come in and say I want 25 pixels on the right, 50 pixels on the bottom, and 25 pixels on the left. And over here, right, we still have 50 pixels all the way around, but if we run this now, scroll down to the box model and select our element again, we'll see now we have our 50 pixels on the top, 25 on the left and right, and 50 pixels of padding on the bottom. Okay, that's the padding around the element. The border is what we actually see, right? The padding is just spacing. It's not visible. It's just a padding between the element, which is the H1, and the content, and the border, which was set to 15 pixels solid green. That's our border. And then there's a margin of 20 pixels all the way around the box or the container. Now this looks a little wider to the right because we have more content area on the page. But if I decrease this and move over the margin, right now I've shrunken the content area, but we can clearly see the margin around the element. Now I could come in and say, let me make that margin 100 on the top, and well, it doesn't really matter because there's not 100 pixels of content between the element and the bottom of the page. So let's actually add an H2, and we'll just add test. So if you run this now, right, we have to go back, and let's go back down and adjust our margins again. So right now there's 20 pixels of margin, which is invisible, right? It's just white spacing around the element at the top, but we can change this to 100. Now we have 100 pixels of spacing. And if I want 100 pixels of spacing between the H1 and the element that comes after it, which happens to be the H2, right, we could change that to 100. If I wanted 50 pixels for a left margin, I could set that to 50, and now it pushes it over. So again, the margin is invisible. It's just a margin between the page, the container, and the box around the content. The border is visible, and we can set the size of the border. In this case, it's 15 pixels all the way around. The padding is between the HTML element, or the content in the element, and the border, and it's invisible. Right? We've given the element a background color of light gray, but that's just the background color inside of the display area of the element. It really has nothing to do with the border. The background color encompasses the display area for the element, which happens to be the content area, and the padding up to the border. So this is a visual representation of the box model, and the reason that it's important is because when you're applying style to your HTML element, you have to take into account the extra display area that's taken up by the margin, the border, and the padding, in addition to the actual content. In the next video, we'll look at applying some of these attributes to our own HTML elements.